Since the socialist state was to be the one controlling force in people's attitudes and behaviors, new potentially disruptive interpersonal networks or micro-communities were not permitted to exist. In the new order there would be only family and state. Church groups and gatherings of those who shared common interests, hobbies, or special characteristics were forbidden. Such groups were prohibited in order to stamp out individuality. First and foremost, one had to be part of the collective societal whole, instead of a pluralistic society. We experienced Orwell's symbiosis of family and television. No other communities or groups were available to help people share thoughts. All groups that did form in order to object to these directions were seen as a threat against the leadership. So they were marginalized, forbidden, and labeled as deviant. In order to survive, one succumbed to a passive life strategy. People did not act on their feelings. They did not join the opposition. As a basic feeling, permanent sacrifice became the life strategy of survival.
If we look at Russia on the world stage, the politics of Russia, it's really impossible to understand this without understanding trauma history. So, Russia's a traumatized country. That's the first thing to understand, and the Ukraine too. So if we look at Russia, Ukraine, and some of the other ex-USSR states, they've just had a horrible, horrible history. If we think about the difficulties under communism, under Stalin, Hitler, and then we go back, most people don't realize most of the casualties in World War II were Russian. That's just a fact, statistically, most of them. 20 million is one figure, and other people say that Stalin killed another 20 million on top of that. So, I mean, if you think about sort of British losses, I think we're maximum 500,000, US losses similar, then just a huge amount of trauma there, plus all the starvation and other problems that were happening around that time. Further back in history, we see that Russia's been invaded by, well, pretty much everyone. The British, obviously, the Crimea, Napoleon, right back to Genghis Khan, Chinese invasions, various things, etc., etc., etc. Also true for Balkan states, the Ukraine, etc. So, essentially what you've got is a traumatized country. Now, trauma is something psychologically overwhelming. So when we talk about trauma, we're not just talking about like, hey, I got stressed this morning because I couldn't find the place we're filming, or some small thing like this. We're talking about something massively overwhelming to the system. And this has a long-term psychological effect which can be passed down through the generations. As it says in the Bible, the sins of the father will be visited onto the son for 5 generations, or is it 7? I don't know. So these things go down through the generations, and patterns get passed on, and then they become culturally normal. So if you see, say, I don't know, a veteran from Afghanistan, lots of those in Russia too, you'll see a person that has potentially psychological issues, not always, but quite often. Now, a whole country developed them. It affects its culture, it affects its politics, how it interacts with other countries. So let's jump in and say the kind of things I'm talking about. So, for example, fear of strangers, fear of the unknown, a sense of us and them. Often Russians seem very unfriendly, the old, Russians don't smile kind of thing. Actually, Russians are very friendly once they know you. But there's this strong sense of us and them, the family or the friends, the group, and not those people. I was just asking for directions this morning, and people are very scared of strangers, even today. And it's not really any reason. I mean, I'm dressed fairly smartly, I'm approaching in a friendly way. My Russian's a bit dodgy, but, it's good enough that they can understand me. But there's this fear in people's bodies of the unknown. So you have to understand, in a political situation, that's the basic stance. Strangers are dangerous. So it's not someone necessarily people think logically or kind of consciously think. It's just in the background as a narrative that people you don't know are out to get you. They're dangerous. So that's the basic frame. Every time Russia interacts politically on the world stage, there's a strong sense of us and them, a slight sense of superiority. Many cultures have that. They're not just the Russians, the Israelis, for example, the Japanese. And this sense of strangers being very dangerous. So the traumatized body, two things happen to it: hyperarousal and numbing. So hyperarousal is that it can be inability to concentrate, it can be getting angry easy. Russians can be quite sort of Mediterranean in how explosive they are. People don't necessarily realize this, particularly when we combine this ease of getting upset. I remember I almost bumped into someone this morning in the street, and they were ready to go straight away. I was like, whoa, calm down, there was an accident, I slipped, you know. So there's that hyperarousal can be in the system. And if we combine that with this sense of face and pride, so a lot of people don't realize that Russians in some ways are Europeans, in some ways are more Asian. So there's this kind of something else really, but this is something like the Chinese, this sense of face or pride. So combined with that hyperarousal, that can be quite dangerous on the world stage in terms of, you know, Putin, for example, having to look a certain way, not wanting to lose face. Yeah. The big one you'll see though with Russians is numbing. So when people talk about the Russian smile, or the Slavic smile, or Ukrainian smile, that we could call armoring physically. This is a term from somatic psychology where there's chronic muscular tension. You might see it in the arms. You see that in Poland too, actually. Other countries that have been traumatized in East Europe. Yeah, and that can lead to a certain numbing, a certain insensitivity. You know, Russians are known for many wonderful things. You know, I love their literature, women, of course, Ukrainian work. This whole area has many wonderful things, but sensitivity is not something Russians aren't known for. That physical toughness can come from this numbing, and unfortunately that can cause problems with empathy. Yeah, that can cause problems with feeling the emotions of others, and also another issue we could look at here is vulnerability. So I'd say because Russians don't feel safe, it's not just they don't feel safe on a deep level, it's also that they're not willing to admit that. So, you know, the whole I'm not scared of anything kind of thing. This vulnerability issue is absolutely key. So you might also come across low self-esteem issues here. I think particularly under communism there was this sense of you don't really matter, what matters is society. And then kind of capitalism has come along and said, you're so amazing. And what you've got is this weird combination, particularly in Moscow, of sort of big ego and low self-esteem. Yeah, this feeling of unsafety is compensated for in physical displays of power. And again, we see this on the political stage. Yeah, that can seem quite crude from outside. It could be compensated for in beauty, in high levels of education. When I go to St. Petersburg, people are always boasting about how many degrees they have, or how many musical instruments their children play, or the sort of crude expressions of wealth that you'll see with Russians in the UK, for example. So these are all expressions of not wanting to be vulnerable, expressions of not wanting to feel that basic unsafety and to try and find safety in the world. Yeah,
becoming committed and involved in the collectivization process in Russia. And it's virtually impossible to overstate how terrible the collectivization process was right from its onset. You know, you'll still hear apologists for Marxism and communism talk about the fact that the Soviet Union was captured by a cult of personality under Stalin, and that that's why the ethical presuppositions of Marxism transformed into political action became so corrupted. But I think that's absolute nonsense, and I think it's nonsense of the most dangerous and reprehensible type. And I think that for two reasons. The first reason was Stalin was an unbelievably murderous thug. He pretty much killed everyone he knew, including almost all of the, they called them, what were they? I don't remember the term. They were old revolutionaries. All of the Bolsheviks who ran the revolution, who didn't die during the revolution or of natural causes afterwards, they were all killed by Stalin. He probably killed his wife. He killed pretty much everybody he knew. I mean, he was like an underground operative for Lenin during the revolution itself, where he learned to be committed from an ideological perspective. He'd come from quite an intensely religious background, committed from an ideological perspective, but then basically acting as a guerrilla assassin during the revolution itself, and then later he rose to power. And he certainly used Lenin's political machinations as a template for his later activity. But Lenin was no piker when it came to extraordinarily brutal activity motivated by utopian dreams. It also simultaneously makes them more susceptible to utopian mass movements of a rational type. And of course, that's exactly what happened with regards to the Marxists and with regards to the fascists. So what Hitler offered his followers in collaboration with them, because it wasn't so much that Hitler told people what he wanted them to think, as it was that Hitler listened to what the crowds wanted and then told it back to them in a collaboration that extended across his entire rule, because Hitler was a great populist and he was very, very good at receiving messages from the audience. But Hitler basically offered his population the dream of racial superiority and world domination, you know, as well as many, many other things that went along with that. So, and then, of course, Marx offered his followers the idea that the oppressed could shed their chains and that everyone could unite, workers and intellectuals alike. In particular, it was more the owning class, the bourgeois, as they're still called by some people, who were the evil oppressors, and the union of worker and intellectual would eventually shepherd in a golden age where everyone offered to society as much as they could offer and took from society as much as they needed, right? And that's the famous phrase, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, which sounds wonderful. You can understand why that would be an attractive slogan, but if you start to think about how that would be administered in practice and you really start to think it through, you realize very, very rapidly that it's a recipe for absolute disaster. Partly because, well, how do you tell the difference between your need and your need? If your mother needs cancer surgery and your genius brother needs to go do his PhD, whose need trumps? Well, and that's just a trivial problem because all of you have those competing needs. And how anybody is ever going to adjudicate between the value of needs is beyond cognitive comprehension. It just can't be done, not without brutality, especially because, you know, there's limited resources. And then the next question is, well, okay, you're supposed to contribute according to your ability. How much ability do you have? You know, that meant in practice was that people were frequently worked to death because ability isn't a definable entity, you know, and unless you have some sort of complicated and functional system to negotiate, to allow people to negotiate amongst themselves peaceably about what they're going to offer and what they're going to take, you have to turn it over to something like a centralized authority. And, you know, it's just, well, you don't need much imagination to understand that would be an absolute catastrophe. And it was an absolute catastrophe. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about Dostoevsky's book, The Devils, is that
Divided brain, divided world. According to McGilchrist, our left and right brain attend the world in different ways, relating to and responding to different aspects of it, and inclining people to express themselves in distinct ways. The left brain has narrower focus and is more goal-oriented. Its tendency is to isolate parts from the whole and to see them in the abstract. It favors consistency and repeatability, likes to categorize, classify, and to predict. It sees cause and effect, seeks to manipulate the world through tools, the most important of these being language. It likes things to be explicit and cannot deal with contradiction. The trend of calling someone out laid the groundwork for full-on cancellations. This makes it both very literal and being also the half of the brain that processes anger, dogmatic. It willfully ignores, anything outside its model of the world. So it lives in a self-referential hall of mirrors, ensuring an optimistic outlook. It controls language, but has little gift for music, with a limited appreciation for anything much beyond rhythm. It has a poor perception of depth, and little appreciation of its place in time, and struggles alone to see or recognize anything in the left visual plane. Cancel culture is a dangerous totalitarian trend. Cancel culture is the very definition of totalitarianism.
Na obszarze całego kraju.
Potem okazało się, że wypowiedzenie wojny polskiemu społeczeństwu to był początek końca komunizmu. Na razie jednak władza komunistyczna przekształciła się w huntę i internowała większość działaczy związkowych oraz zdelegalizowała Solidarność. Wzmogły się represje.
One of Jordan Peterson's core ideas is the human capacity for evil, and his great examples are the crimes of Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and Communist China. What's notable about all three, he wrote, is not just the atrocities committed by the ruling party, but that the regimes were sustained by the consent of ordinary people. Under certain circumstances, Peterson believes almost all of us are potential secret police informers and concentration camp guards. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. His heroes are people such as Viktor Frankl, the Viennese psychiatrist, who found a meaning in life to sustain him in a Nazi death camp. Václav Havel, who lived in truce despite his frequent imprisonment in communist Czechoslovakia. And above all, the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who survived Soviet forced labor camps and found a way to tell the world about them. Havel condemned those who went along with the regime, such as the greengrocer who put up a sign saying, "Workers of the world unite," because doing so is a path of least resistance. Solzhenitsyn went so far as to blame himself for helping make the Gulag possible by failing to contract the Soviet regime's lying propaganda. So the choice is stark. Either be willing to say no, no matter what the cost, or be a potential cog in the killing machine.
Wydawała niezależne pisma, a organizowane przez nią pokojowe manifestacje były rozbijane przez reżim.
Now, one of the things that's really interesting about Dostoevsky's book, The Devils, is that it segues almost perfectly into Alexander Solzhenitsyn's description of the emergence of the Russian prisoners, the Soviet prison camps after the revolution. So basically what happened, and this is what Solzhenitsyn revealed in the 1970s, was that because the communist system was so financially untenable, the principles just didn't work for all sorts of reasons, the system ended up running basically on a system of work camps. And so much of what the Russians produced, the Soviets produced, which wasn't very much, by the way, although they got industrialized very, very rapidly, was produced by people who were basically enslaved. And that's the only way the system could continue to function. Now, Solzhenitsyn estimated that between 1919, which is basically the end of the First World War, and 1959, which is basically when the Stalinist era came to an end, so that's only 40 years, that 60 million people were killed in the Soviet Union as a consequence of internal repression. That didn't count the Second World War. People complain about his numbers, claiming that a death count of 60 million people over that period of time is mathematically untenable. But more reasonable estimates, if you want to put it that way, put it up to 20 or 30 million. And the truth of the matter is that no one knows, and that even makes it worse. I mean, we do know, for example, that the attempts at collectivization in the 1920s led to the creation of an agricultural catastrophe made worse by Stalin's peculiar economic policies that killed 6 million people in the Ukraine in the 1930s.
What is it today to which we need to say no? It is whether to go along with unprovoked military aggression, assassinations, preventive detention, torture, or suspects, warrantless surveillance, and all the other practices of police states, all of which have come to be accepted as normal.
Czasu, ja myślę, gdzieś od drugiej połowy lat 80. było narastające poczucie, że możliwości reformy i naprawienia systemu są coraz bardziej ograniczone i mało skuteczne.
Tych zaklęć partyjnych mieli świadomość, że to się nie udało. My widzieli, że to się nie udało, że tu żaden komunizm nie został wprowadzony, że sytuacja gospodarcza jest fatalna, że opozycja została w jakimś sensie tak pozbawiona może takiego wigoru, ale broń Boże nie zniszczona.
Leczenie bezrodności. Natomiast zaczęło pojawiać się to pokolenie, które takiego doświadczenia nie miało i w tym pokoleniu rósł radykalizm. I można było się wobec tego spodziewać, że prędzej czy później może dojść bez zasadniczych zmian do drastycznych konfrontacji. Świadomość tej konfrontacji i niechęć do tej konfrontacji była dość wyrazista w pewnej części establishmentu politycznego, kierownictwa państwa.
Ordinary Americans let themselves be led step by step to committing atrocities such as the My Lai massacre or the Abu Ghraib tortures. Until more of us learn to say no, we will be just like ordinary Germans. Hitler's Germany, Stalin's USSR, and Mao's China were alike in being ruled by a leader who claimed infallibility, supported by a single political party, based on an ideology that couldn't be questioned, and was willing to kill people by the millions.
Juhan Aara was an Estonian delegate to the Soviet Congress of People's Deputies from 1989 to 1991. He was a signatory to a document which proved to be a time bomb that would destroy the very foundations of the communist regime.
Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи. Сегодня в Москве продолжил работу съезд народных депутатов СССР.
But on the 1st of June 1989, the Estonian deputy Endel Lippmaa proposed the setting up of a committee to investigate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and its secret clauses.
Kõigi poolt ja siin on endiselt sees väga oluline punkt. Признает протоколы юридически несостоятельными и недействительными с момента их подписания. See on otsustava tähtsusega osa.
Михаил Сергеевич Горбачев поддержал предложение о создании комиссии по оценке этого договора. Съезд поддержал предложение о создании комиссии и поручил депутатам республик Прибалтики и Президиуму внести предложение по ее составу.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in Moscow on the 23rd of August 1939, was a non-aggression treaty devised by Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov and Nazi Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop. But it also included a secret protocol, Under the terms of the pact, Stalin could occupy the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, and declare war on Finland. In return, Hitler was to have a free hand in Poland. A week later, on the 1st of September 1939, the German Wehrmacht invaded Poland and the Second World War began. At the Nuremberg trials, Stalin is supposed to have sent a message to von Ribbentrop, now in the dock, accused of war crimes. It was said that Stalin offered to save his life if von Ribbentrop would deny the existence of the secret protocols in the 1939 pact. Von Ribbentrop refused. The former German foreign minister took the stand and revealed the truth about the secret agreement between Hitler and Stalin. The International Tribunal passed the death sentence on von Ribbentrop. He was the first Nazi to be hung at the Nuremberg trials. Despite von Ribbentrop's testimony, Stalin, Molotov, and their successors always denied the existence of any secret protocols. The biggest secret in the diplomatic history of the Soviet Union was revealed for the first time only in the summer of 1989, when an Estonian deputy, lawyer Igor Gretsin, read it out in full at the Kremlin Palace of Congresses. When the secret protocols were declared null and void, later in December 1989, it marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Empire.
In certain important ways, though, Nazi Germany was different from the others. I think that if the United States ever becomes totalitarian, it will resemble Nazi Germany or fascist Italy much more than any of the communist countries. The Soviet Union and Chinese People's Republic were revolutionary. Their rulers tore down the old social structures and tried to replace them with something new. Nazi Germany preserved the old social structure in form. There were businesses which continued to pay dividends. There were churches which continued to conduct religious services. Outwardly little changed. Most Germans lived their lives as they did before 1933. But they were controlled by an invisible parallel structure, the Nazi Party. The atrocities of Stalin and Mao were committed inwardly, against their people, in order to strengthen the power and to implement economic theories that did not work. Mao surely did not intend that millions of Chinese should die as a result of his agricultural policies. They died because he was unwilling to accept criticism or face facts.
In 1966, Mao Zedong had a problem. The Chinese leader, who had led a peasant army to victory in the Chinese Civil War and established the Communist People's Republic of China in 1949, was getting old. Worse, his radical policies had devastated the country and triggered the deadliest famine known to human history. By the early 1960s, Mao's once great influence and public presence were at an all-time low, and there were rumors that he was dying, or even dead already. He needed to find a way to seal his legacy as the face of Chinese communism, and a new revolution to lead. It started in a river. Great Leap Forward was a disaster. It was Mao's 1958 plan to quickly industrialize China by working its massive peasant population non-stop.
He promises to transform the People's Republic into an instant paradise through the sheer force of numbers.
Forcing workers in the countryside to farm crops on government-run communes, and millions more to manufacture crude steel in homemade blast furnaces. And even though Mao told the world that the plan was succeeding,
everywhere the communists report, production records are being broken.
The truth was much more desperate.
They flood the fields, exhaust the soil, and farm production, instead of going up, goes down.
The Chinese people were being forced to work tirelessly on land they once owned themselves, and they were starting to lose morale. And despite reports of widespread famine with millions of people starving to death, Mao kept production quotas high.
The pace grows more frantic. Ceaselessly without rest, one observer writes, the countryside is in convulsion.
Mao's Great Leap Forward ended in 1962. By that time, somewhere between 23 and 55 million people had died in the famine. Over in the Soviet Union, a different political upheaval was happening. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who Mao modeled himself after, was dead. And Mao watched as Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, implemented a period known as de-Stalinization, where Khrushchev set out to reverse many of Stalin's policies and dismantle the personality cult that had formed around him. Mao saw his own legacy potentially suffering the same fate. His communist revolution was long over, and his ideas weren't taken as seriously after the disaster of the Great Leap Forward. It was starting to look like Mao's place in the pantheon of powerful communist figures, like Vladimir Lenin and Karl Marx, was in peril. This is where the river comes in. Mao had a reputation for being a strong swimmer, and even used it as a symbol of his ideology. In 1956, he swam across China's biggest river, the Yangtze, in 3 highly publicized swims to demonstrate that big things, like US imperialism, didn't intimidate him. 10 years later, Mao took on the Yangtze again to dispel rumors of his failing health, this time with cheering crowds swimming alongside him. He brought his personal photographer, who snapped this photo of the aging dictator in the river, and another one, showing Mao waving to his fellow swimmers with the landmark Wuhan Yangtze River Bridge behind him, an iconic architectural achievement of the communist government and proof that he was at the Yangtze. The swim made the front page of China's state newspaper, reporting that Mao swam around 15 kilometers, a little more than 9 miles, in a span of 65 minutes, which meant the 72-year-old would have shattered world speed records. A lot of people outside of China laughed at the outlandish story, but some saw the swim for what it was, a sinister sign, pointing out that Mao's swims from a decade earlier preceded the catastrophic Great Leap Forward. Experts feared that Mao was on the verge of kicking off another disastrous period of turmoil in China. They were right. 2 months before the swim, Mao had announced the beginning of his great proletarian cultural revolution, a call to hunt down and eliminate the bourgeoisie who had sneaked into the party, basically to purge the government of anyone who strayed from principles of Maoism. And it kicked into high gear after his historic swim, which prompted a craze for swimming in China, but more importantly, a craze for Mao, especially among the group that Mao wanted to influence the most, China's youth. Writer Lang Heng recalled that seeing Mao as human flesh and blood after the Yangtze swim resolved him to serve him with all his heart. Millions of Chinese youth organized into the fanatical Red Guards, a paramilitary force concentrated mostly in Chinese cities. And with Mao's blessing, they wreaked havoc in the name of cultural revolution. Their mission was to destroy the 4 olds.
Old culture, old ideology, old customs, old traditions, all of the olds must be destroyed.
The idea was basically to tear down the vestiges of imperial China and rewrite history centered around Mao Zedong, renaming buildings and streets, destroying cultural sites, and violently humiliating and often torturing and murdering anyone they accused of opposing Mao's ideas.
Wird auch der Protest, es wird dieses in Zweifel ziehen, dieses offiziellen Corona-Pandemie-Narrativs, ja. Es wird pathologisiert. Der kann ja, jemand, der sich anzweifelt, der ist ja nicht ganz dicht, der ist ja wohl krank. Oder der ist vielleicht sogar psychisch krank, das ist ein Esoteriker, ein Spinner. Und es gibt auch sogar Studien, die sagen, das wären Psychopathen und Verrückte. Ja. Also da fange ich an, zu sagen, da steht die Welt auf dem Kopf. Diejenigen Menschen, die sich noch Gedanken machen, die noch kritisch sind, die noch hinschauen, die sind plötzlich diejenigen, die unnormal, die nicht mehr normal sein sollen. Kennen wir ja, diese Strategie kennen wir aus den kommunistischen Regimes, aus der DDR, aus der Sowjetunion. Da wurde das genauso gemacht. Jemand, der den Sozialismus nicht für gut findet, der landet in der Psychiatrie. Und das kennen wir auch aus dem Nationalsozialismus, dass die Menschen, die Einwände hatten, als Volksschädlinge gebrandmarkt wurden und damit als, ja, nicht normale